I rise this evening in opposition to the nomination of Betsy DeVos to be our next Secretary of Education. This is one of the most important jobs in our government. The Department of Education bears the responsibility for making sure that every child in America has the opportunity to fulfill his or her potential, which means that the Secretary of Education has an enormous amount of power to shape our nation's future. So this is not a job for amateurs. President Obama's first Secretary of Education was Arne Duncan, who had spent 7.5 years building a record of accomplishment as CEO of Chicago's public school system, previous to which he had been the director of a mentoring program and the founder of a charter school. When Secretary Duncan stepped down, he was replaced by Dr. John King Jr., the recipient of a doctorate in education administrative practice, who had served as Deputy Secretary under Arne Duncan, and who had been previously the Education Commissioner for the state of New York. Each brought to the job a background in public education that informed their understanding of what students and parents and teachers and administrators need in order to succeed. Which brings me to Betsy DeVos. There were reasons to be skeptical about Mrs. DeVos's nomination right off the bat. As my Republican colleague, Senator Collins of Maine, put it, the mission of the Department of Education is broad, but supporting public education is at its core. Well, in Mrs. DeVos, President Trump sent us a nominee with no experience in public education. Mrs. DeVos has never been a public school superintendent, or a public school principal, or a public school teacher. She has never attended a public school. She has never sent a child to a public school. Mrs. DeVos has no formal background in education, no classroom experience, and no demonstrated commitment to supporting public education whatsoever. In fact, Mrs. DeVos has a long history of actively undermining public education. She and her family have spent millions of dollars advocating for an ideology that would steal funds from public schools in order to fund private and religious education. Let's take a moment to talk about what that means. Mrs. DeVos ran a political action committee called All Children Matter, which spent millions in campaign contributions to promote the use of taxpayer dollars for school vouchers. The argument was that these vouchers would allow low-income students to leave the public school system and attend the private or religious school of their family's choice. Mrs. DeVos has described this as school choice, claiming that it would give parents the chance to choose the best school for their children, but that's just not how it works. In reality, most school vouchers don't cover the full cost of private school tuition, nor do they cover additional expenses like transportation, school uniforms, and other supplies, which means the vouchers don't create more choices for low-income families. They simply subsidize existing choices for families who could already afford to pay for private school. And as it happens, we have a real-life test case that we can look at to determine whether Mrs. DeVos's argument holds water. Mrs. DeVos helped develop a voucher program in the state of Indiana. And guess what happened? Today, more than half of the students in the Hoosier state who receive vouchers never actually attended Indiana public schools in the first place, which means their families were already in a position to pay for private schools. Indeed, vouchers are going to families earning as much as $150,000 a year. Now, I'm sure these families appreciated the extra help, but as of 2015, nearly half of Indiana children relied on free and reduced price lunch programs. These are the kids Mrs. DeVos claimed would be helped by school vouchers. Instead, taxpayer dollars were taken away from public schools that remain the only choice for these low-income families and given to families who could already afford private school, who were already sending their kids to private school. That is the reality of school vouchers. And that's why, after Mrs. DeVos developed a similar proposal for a voucher program in Pennsylvania, and an analysis projected that, just like in Indiana, the vouchers would mostly benefit kids already enrolled in private schools, voters rejected it on multiple occasions. And yet, Mrs. DeVos and her family have continued their fight for school vouchers. In fact, she has been such a fervent advocate that her political action committee, All Children Matter, received the largest fine for violating election law in Ohio's state history, a $5.3 million fine that nearly a decade later she still hasn't paid. Now, why do this? The evidence is clear that Mrs. DeVos' voucher obsession doesn't help low-income families. Quite the contrary, it represents a serious threat to the public school system, a system that 90% of our children rely on, but that Mrs. DeVos described as a, quote, a dead end. The truth is that Mrs. DeVos's education advocacy isn't really about education at all. She described her goal as follows: to advance God's kingdom. Now, many families choose to send their children to religious schools, and many children receive an excellent education at religious schools. But it's the school's part that the Secretary of Education is supposed to focus on, and that's not the part that Mrs. DeVos and her family have put at the forefront of their advocacy. Mrs. DeVos spent a decade serving on the board of the Acton Institute, which seeks to infuse religion into public life, beginning with public education. She and her family have devoted millions to promote the Institute's work, including promoting ideas like this, quote, "We must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, and no neutral civil government. Then they will get busy in constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God." Those are the words of Gary North, a Christian dominionist for whom the Acton Institute served as a forum. Of course, not everyone who believes in the potential of parochial schools shares his view, but this is the kind of stuff Mrs. DeVos and her family have spent millions and millions of dollars promoting. It's fine for someone to hold strong religious views and to advocate for those views and to spend their family fortune encouraging others to adopt them. But it's entirely fair to ask whether the mission of building a Bible-based social, political, and religious order is compatible with the mission of the Department of Education. So yes, based on Mrs. DeVos's radical ideology, I was skeptical when her nomination was sent to the Senate. But I understand that others in this body may not have shared my discomfort. Within this chamber, we have important differences when it comes to education policy, and for that matter, the appropriateness of using taxpayer funds to advance God's kingdom. And you know what? That's fine. But we all have the exact same responsibility when it comes to vetting the president's cabinet nominees. Each of us is called upon to determine not just whether we agree with the nominee's ideology, but whether that nominee is free from relevant conflicts of interest, and critically, whether the nominee is competent, whether he or she is capable of doing the job. Making that call is our job. And that's why we have the process that we have. It's why we ask to see nominees' financial information. It's why we ask them to submit written answers to questionnaires about their experience and their record. And it's why we have them come to the Senate to sit in front of committees and to answer our questions. And unfortunately, during her hearing, Mrs. DeVos proved beyond a shadow of a doubt not only that her ideology is fundamentally incompatible with the mission of the Department of Education, but that she is fundamentally incompetent to be its leader. Throughout the hearing, she was unable to answer basic questions about her views on important issues. She was unfamiliar with basic concepts of education policy. And she was unwilling to make basic commitments to continue the department's work on behalf of our most vulnerable children. Now, let me give you one example of what I mean. During my 5 minutes of questioning, I asked Mrs. DeVos to weigh in on the debate about measuring growth versus measuring proficiency. I'm going to take a few moments right now to make sure that everyone here and everyone watching at home understands what this debate is about and just how central it is to the future of education policy. The difference between the two approaches, proficiency and growth, is very easy to explain. Let's say a 5th grade teacher has a student who comes into the classroom reading at a 2nd grade level. And over the course of the school year, the teacher brings the student up to a 4th grade level. If we're measuring growth, we'd say, well, that teacher brought that student up 2 grade levels in 1 year. That teacher is a hero. If we're measuring for proficiency, we'd say, well, that student is still reading below grade level. That teacher is a failure. That's the difference between measuring growth and measuring proficiency. It took me all of, what, 30 seconds to explain that. But I could spend all night talking about what this debate means for students, teachers, school leaders, and our entire education system. Everyone agrees that there should be accountability in our education system, accountability for school systems, accountability for schools, accountability for classroom teachers. We want to know that we're getting results. That was the core idea behind all the standardized testing in No Child Left Behind. The problem was that No Child Left Behind set up a system in which we assess student learning by measuring proficiency and only proficiency. And as the law was implemented, all sorts of problems emerged from taking this approach. For example, teachers in Minnesota would tell me how measuring proficiency would lead to what they called a race to the middle. See, measuring proficiency only measures whether or not students are performing at grade level, at this line of proficiency, at grade level. And a teacher is measured by what percentage of her students are, or his students are above proficiency or at proficiency. And teachers did not get credit for helping kids who were already well above grade level to perform better. And they didn't get credit for helping kids who are way below grade level start to catch up. So we had this race to the middle, because it's a yes or no question. Did this student achieve proficiency or not? And a teacher's entire career could depend on how many of his or her students met that arbitrary goal. So under this system, Mr. President, understand this, please. A teacher had a strong incentive to ignore all the students at the top who were already going to meet proficiency. No matter what you did to that kid was going to beat proficiency in the No Child Left Behind test at the end of the year. And an incentive to ignore all the kids at the bottom. Because no matter what you did, that student wouldn't reach proficiency. The only thing, or one of the only things I liked about No Child Left Behind was the name. And we were leaving behind the kids at the top and the kids at the bottom because of proficiency, the insistence on proficiency. I can't overstate how central this issue is to education. And I can't tell you how important it is to educators across America. If you talk to any state education secretary, any district superintendent, any local school board member, any principal, any classroom teacher, and heck, parents, they will have an opinion on measuring growth versus measuring proficiency. So when Mrs. DeVos came before the Help Committee, I asked her opinion on this very basic, this extremely basic extremely important question. And she had no idea what I was talking about. Let me be clear. She wasn't reluctant to declare her opinion. She wasn't trying to strike a middle ground. She did not know what I was talking about. We would not accept a Secretary of Defense who couldn't name the branches of the military. We wouldn't accept a Secretary of State who couldn't identify Europe on a map. We wouldn't accept a Treasury Secretary who doesn't understand multiplication. In fact, in nearly any circumstances, if a candidate for a job is asked a question that basic and that important and simply whiffs on it the way that Mrs. DeVos did, there's no second question. Just a thank you for your time, we'll let you know, and will you please send in the next candidate? You know, earlier this year, the University of Minnesota hired a new head football coach. I wasn't there for the interview, but imagine if the first question a candidate for the football coach of your university was as follows: how many yards does it take to get a first down? And imagine if the candidate answers as follows: thank you for your question, Mr. Athletic Director. I can pledge with you that I will work very hard to get as many first downs as possible, to make sure we hope leading to touchdowns. That wasn't the question. The question was, how many yards does it take to get a first down? Well, thank you again for the question. I can tell you this: I will look forward to working with you to prevent the other team from getting first downs also. Understand, that's how basic my question to Mrs. DeVos was, and that's how shocking it was that she simply didn't know enough about education policy to answer it. This inexplicable failure alone was enough for me to conclude that Mrs. DeVos lacked the knowledge and understanding that should be a bare minimum for anyone seeking the position. But the entire hearing was a showcase for her lack of qualifications. If any of my colleagues didn't have a chance to watch it, haven't had a chance to watch, Mr. President, I would urge you and anyone who hasn't had, any of my colleagues who hasn't had a chance to watch it, I urge you to do so before casting a vote for this nominee. It was one of the most embarrassing scenes I've witnessed during my time in the United States Senate. In fact, I believe it may have been one of the most embarrassing performances by a nominee in the history of the United States Senate. Asked about the right of children with disabilities to get a quality public education, she didn't know that this right is protected by a federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Asked about guns in schools, she suggested that maybe schools should be kept on hand in case grizzly bears attack. This was in answer to a question from Senator Murphy, who in Congress represented Sandy Hook, who as a senator represents those parents. That was her answer to him. Asked about whether she would hold private and parochial schools that get taxpayer funding to the same standard of accountability as public schools, she couldn't or wouldn't say. Asked about a family foundation that has donated millions of dollars to an organization promoting conversion therapy for LGBT youth, she claimed she had no involvement, which is ridiculous, even if Mrs. DeVos's own role as vice president of that foundation was a 13-year clerical error, as she now claims. She herself has donated approximately $75,000 to support that anti-LGBT organization's work. Now understand, none of these were difficult questions. None of these were gotchas. And all of these failures took place during a single 5-minute per senator round of questioning. Because after that first round, the hearing was cut off and our chairman refused to allow any further questioning. By the way, I'd like to say a word about that move to cut off questioning. I have great respect for the chairman of the Help Committee, Lamar Alexander. We worked together, and he worked with Patty together on the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, changing it to ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. I respect the chairman tremendously. But his decision to end that hearing was wrong, and his rationale was simply false. Our chairman insisted that because both Secretary Duncan and Secretary King had been subject to only a single round of questions, there was a precedent to deny the minority a second round of questioning of Mrs. DeVos. That simply isn't so. First of all, as I discussed earlier, both Arne Duncan and John King were experienced education professionals with long records of public service. Even if Republican members had occasion to disagree with them on policy matters, there was no question that their backgrounds had prepared them for the job of Secretary of Education. And that's the bigger point here. There were no further questions. In both cases, committee members weren't denied the opportunity for a second round of questioning. They simply chose not to engage in one. Indeed, when I asked the Congressional Research Service, they confirmed that those hearings did not establish the precedent that our chairman claimed. Instead of allowing us to question Mrs. DeVos further, the chairman invited us to submit additional questions in writing, presumably so that she'd get some help from her Trump administration handlers in answering them. Even so, her written responses only served to further expose her own lack of understanding of how education policy affects Americans. For example, I asked Mrs. DeVos in writing about the effect of trauma and adverse childhood experiences on education. This is a subject I've been interested in for a long time. A lot of kids in our country live in extreme poverty. Some may have a parent in prison or a parent who has passed away. These kids may also experience physical abuse or emotional abuse or neglect. There may be some drug or alcohol abuse taking place in the house. Some have witnessed domestic violence in their homes or street violence in their neighborhoods. Some have seen siblings shot and killed right in front of them. Decades of research have shown that the trauma that comes from such adverse childhood experiences actually changes a child's brain chemistry and affects their behavioral development, their mental and physical health, and their chances to succeed in society, in school, and in society long term. But research has also shown that these challenges can be overcome, and that the kids who do overcome them are the most resilient kids you've ever met. Our public education system was designed to give these kids a shot. But teachers and administrators often lack the resources they need to give these children the chance that they deserve. And because Mrs. DeVos's crusade for school vouchers would further rob our public schools of these limited funds, I wanted to know her thoughts on this important issue. Mrs. DeVos's answer, a written answer, this is a take-home. Her answer was brief and superficial. She wrote that she had heard that children are impacted by trauma and that trauma can cause difficulties in a child's education. That was it. Was she unfamiliar with the literature? Was she unwilling to acknowledge that poor kids face special challenges? Would she be remotely interested in addressing these challenges as Secretary of Education? I guess we may never know. I also asked Mrs. DeVos in writing about her vision for education in rural communities. As the president knows, the governor and now senator from South Dakota, many of our children in America attend schools in rural America, 10 million American kids. Schools that struggle with teacher shortages and transportation challenges. I asked how would her school choice agenda help them. In her response, she pointed to online schools, which are often run by for-profit companies, many with questionable records. In fact, one of the country's biggest online schools recently agreed to a $168.5 million settlement in California for allegedly defrauding families. $168.5 million settlement. But even online schools that aren't out to rip off students often wind up failing them. A 2015 Stanford study showed that on average, kids in online schools lose the equivalent of 72 days of learning in reading and 180 days of learning in math, and that's for each 180-day school year. Which means that kids in online schools can fall up to a year behind in math. And of course, as the presiding officer knows, as the president knows, many rural communities lack reliable broadband and access to I've been on rural education tours where I find that students go to a McDonald's, to the parking lot, so they can get some Wi-Fi to read at their public school an assignment or get materials to study. This was yet another answer that wasn't an answer at all, yet another piece of evidence that Ms. DeVos is simply not up to this job. Mr. President, like many Americans, I have serious concerns about many aspects of the Trump administration's agenda. Still, I believe that as a United States Senator, it is my job to evaluate each nominee on his or her own merits. That's why I voted for nominees like Secretary Mattis and Secretary Chao, even though I disagree with them on important issues. General Mattis, for example, has nearly a half-century of military service under his belt, and he has earned the respect of leaders on both sides of the aisle, and I believe he will be a much-needed voice of reason on the Trump administration's foreign policy team. Ms. Chao has a lengthy background in public service, including as Secretary of Labor and Deputy Secretary of Transportation. And I believe she will bring significant and valuable experience to her important role. I may well take issue with the decisions that they make and the agenda that they implement as members of President Trump's cabinet, but at the very least, each illustrated during their confirmation hearings that they have a basic understanding of the issues that they will be responsible for. Mrs. DeVos is different. I've heard from Minnesotans about many of President Trump's nominees, but the outcry over this nomination far surpasses anything else. As of a week ago, my office had received 3,000 calls about this nominee. A grand total of 12 were in favor of her confirmation. Additionally, we received more than 18,000 letters and emails, and again, the overwhelming majority of them have urged me to oppose this nomination. For example, a woman from Brainerd, Minnesota, wrote to say that she'd never contacted one of her representatives before and didn't consider herself very political. In fact, she was neither a Democrat nor a Republican. But she has a daughter in second grade and a son beginning kindergarten in the fall, and she wanted me to vote against Betsy DeVos. How, she asked, is someone who's never had any experience in public education supposed to competently preside over it? A mother of two public school students in Faribault, Minnesota, wrote of Mrs. DeVos, as I watched her during the hearing, I was in disbelief that she would be appointed to such an important position. Another constituent from Warren, Minnesota, wrote, this woman is so unqualified, it's scary. Last week, I went to dinner with Vice President Walter Mondale. I went to his favorite restaurant. And so afterwards, he took me into the kitchen to greet some of the men and women who worked at the restaurant. And one of the guys in the kitchen, I'm a little unclear of this, whether he was taking dishes to the dishwasher or he was washing dishes. He's not a teacher, he's not an education advocate, just a guy who works in the kitchen. And he said, please vote against Mrs. DeVos. There's a reason why this nomination has been met with such overwhelming resistance on the part of the American people, and I know I'm not the only one who has heard it. In fact, two of my Republican colleagues and fellow Help Committee members who sat through that hearing, Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, have stepped forward to announce that they cannot vote for this nominee. They don't agree with me on every aspect of education policy, but believe me, when we put ESSA together, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the committee, was it unanimous? Voted unanimously on that. There's a lot of agreement on education policy on our committee. But Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski saw the same hearing that I did. And like me, they saw a nominee who simply does not understand the needs of the students our Secretary of Education is supposed to serve. I'll let my colleagues speak for themselves as to the reasons why they'll be joining me in voting against this nominee. But I'd like to close by asking a few questions of my colleagues who are still considering a vote in her favor. If Mrs. DeVos's performance didn't convince you that she lacks the qualifications for this job, what would have to have happened in that hearing in order to convince you? If you cannot bring yourself to vote against this nominee, is there anyone President Trump could nominate for any position that you could vote against? And if we cannot set party loyalty aside long enough to perform the essential duty of vetting the president's nominees, what are we even doing here? Mr. President, the Constitution gives us that power to reject cabinet nominations specifically so that we can prevent fundamentally ill-equipped nominees like Betsy DeVos from assuming positions of power for which they are not qualified. Let's do our job. For the sake of our children, let's do our job. I yield the floor.